so this is the second section of the history. We covered mostly things that happened in Europe in the first section, but now we're going to talk about things that happened in early America and then all the way up to today. So as I said in the first section, you have to remember that the industry is cyclical. It goes up and down, it goes in cycles. So that happened actually also in early America. So one of the first things that happened in early America was that when George Washington became president, he went on a tour for the first few years of his presidency, and a lot of the major cities that he was going to tour didn't have really nice hotels for the time. So he would have to stay in like little inns and not things that were appropriate for a new president. So a lot of the local businessmen in those areas got together and said, hey, George Washington's coming to our town in a few months or a year. We need to build a nice hotel that's good enough for a president. So even though this is kind of one of those opportunities, even though George Washington's presidential tour had really nothing to do with the hotel industry, it impacted the hotel industry because these people who ran these cities wanted George Washington to have a nice hotel to stay in. So something to remember is that Cole's Ordinary was the first inn in the United States. It was established in 1634 in Boston, Massachusetts. And just like it is in the movies, a lot of times they use these inns as almost unofficial city halls. All the men would get together and drink and kind of talk about the day's activities or what was going on in society. Kind of an aside is, and they can't really 100% prove this, but they say that the Patriots were at Cole's Ordinary before the Boston Tea Party. They had a couple of drinks, and then they went and had the Boston Tea Party where they threw the tea over into the bay. So these type of inns were really common and a big part of early America. The first hotel is typically considered the City Hotel in New York. And the reason that it's one of the first hotels is that because it was the first that really got a group of businessmen together to build it. It was one of the largest buildings in New York at the time, and it cost in 1797 the huge amount of $100,000 to build. And then one of the major hotels in terms of innovation was the Buffalo Statler Hotel, which was built in 1908, and it was the first standardized modern hotel, and his slogan, Statler's slogan, was a bed and a bath for $1.50. So we need to remember what was going on in the United States at that time, and a lot of people started to travel by Model T cars, so the roads were muddy, they were kind of covered in mud. So what Statler did was, it was one of the first times that people had individual rooms. They had their own bath. They had full-length mirrors so they could kind of see that they were covered in mud, or once they were clean, that they weren't covered in mud. So Statler is typically considered an innovator and one of the leaders in our industry because of some of the things that he implemented. So some other innovators and early leaders were Fred Harvey. He developed the Harvey House hotels that were associated with the Harvey House restaurants. And they basically went along the Southern Pacific Railroad across the country, and they built hotels and restaurants kind of along all of the stops. And he and his people kind of helped develop across the United States. Statler, as I mentioned, he's also considered by many to be the father of the American hotel industry because of all of the innovations that he implemented. We're all familiar with Conrad Hilton. The reason with Hilton, the name, Conrad Hilton bought his first hotel in 1919 in Cisco, Texas. And the reason I put banker's mentality is because he actually was a banker. And he went to Cisco to purchase a bank. And as the story goes, that deal fell through. And instead of buying a bank, he bought the hotel that he was staying in. And then he obviously built an empire from there. But what Hilton's for a long, long time were considered, actually one of their slogans was America's business address. So they were considered a very business-oriented hotel. Now they've gotten into resorts and other areas, but for many years, Hilton was, as I said, America's business address. And then the last one here, there are many other leaders and innovators. These are just a few that I chose, is Kemmons Wilson, and he developed Holiday Inns in 1952. And the interesting story there was that he went on vacation with his family, and he really didn't find any consistency with the types of hotels, mostly motels, that he and his family stayed in. So he came back from that vacation, quit his job, and started Holiday Inn. And Holiday Inn's thing for a long, long time was standardization. Every Holiday Inn was very similar. Kids ate for free. You could park your car right by your hotel room. So they standardized things. And once again, now over the times, Holiday Inn has changed and gone into so many different markets that it's not standardized, but that's kind of really the way it started out. So quickly, I'm going to go through the decades in early America. In the 20s, it was the golden age of hotels. We more or less just come out of World War I. So unprecedented building occupancy, people were traveling, everything was great. Obviously, during the Great Depression, things were not great. And 85% of hotels were either in receivership or liquidation, meaning basically they went either bankrupt or the bank owned them. So just like every other business during the Great Depression, the hotel industry suffered. Then we have World War II, where we had unprecedented occupancy because there wasn't much material for expansion. We lost a lot of hotels in the 30s. There weren't that many in the 40s, but there was a lot of travel, mostly military travel. So those hotels that were open had unprecedented occupancy. This is the highest occupancy ever in our history. So in the 50s, there were a number of different things that happened that we need to look at in terms of the growth of motel chains. One is there were a number of reasons why travel increased after World War II. The first is that there was pent-up demand. So the men came back from Europe or Japan, depending on where they were for the war. They came back and their spouse and children had been there for sometimes years. And so they wanted to kind of go on a little vacation, spend some time together. A main reason that this was that the United States at this time kind of opened up to travel was the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. And you can see I have it highlighted here. And what happened at this point was that President Eisenhower, who had been the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe during the war, saw the efficiency of the Autobahn in Germany, mostly because how efficient it was in terms of moving military personnel. So when he came back and was president, he thought that this would be a good idea for the United States. It inadvertently helped the hotel industry and travel industry, but really his main reason for this act was to build huge highways that could help us in case of a military occupation of the United States. So that's like your main highways, 80, 20, the main interstate highways were all built as a result of this act. And many of them have really long stretches of roads. And the reason for that is that in an emergency, if we were under a war situation, that those could be used for emergency runways or landing strips for airplanes. One of the reasons. Also, it makes it easier to mobilize military equipment. So the transportation improvements helped with the Interstate Highway Act of 1956. There was also a desire to travel. Men had traveled all around the world, were more accustomed to it, so they had a desire to travel a little bit more than they may have before. And the last thing is that during this period that while men were off at war, many women were back at home working, and that the whole Rosie the Riveter became popular, and women started to work in the plants, but then also in other areas. So what happened was, for a lot of families, the man came back and the woman said, hey, I still would like to work because now I have friends, I have income, and I would like to work. And this was really the beginning of a larger, not to say that women hadn't worked before this, but this became a larger of the two income families. So now with more disposable income, the families had more money so they could travel a little bit more. So there were a lot of things that happened in the 50s. I'll go through the other decades pretty quickly. In the 60s, there was a large growth of hotel chains. That's when Hyatt, Howard Johnson's, Marriott's kind of came. Howard Johnson's, Marriott's were restaurants before, but the hotel chains really started to build up in the 60s. In the 70s, we had a lot of market segmentation where hotels were gearing towards specific markets. Like I said, Hilton into the business and some others into more of the leisure markets. The 80s were good in the beginning, but then we had some overexpansion and it went pretty bad at the end of the 80s. 90s, the beginning of the 90s was bad. We recovered a little bit. There were a lot of mergers in the hotel industry in the 1990s as well. Then obviously with September 11th, 2001, there was a major decrease in travel because of terrorism and people were afraid to travel. We had a little bit of recovery in 2004 and increases in supply and demand in ADR. But then we had another recession in 7 that trickled into 8, 9. 2009 was one of the worst years in terms of all of these in our history, year to date, not in terms of numbers as a whole. And then since then, we've had this slow recovery where we've kind of built up, and as we said in the pre-test in 2015, we had some records of how high some of the figures were. The last thing I want to discuss in terms of history is to just show you one city and how its history also mirrored what was going on in the United States. And that city that I chose is Las Vegas. So once again, you can see the cyclical nature of things. It goes up and down, up and down, up and down. So we start here with the Wide Open Gambling Act, and then throughout this, then we have dips in 9/11. We have some high peaks here, and then we have a recession, and we're now obviously in a little bit of a recovery. So some things to remember about Las Vegas history. It all began in 1931 with the Wide Open Gambling Act. As we said earlier, in the 1930s, the United States was in the Great Depression. So the state of Nevada decided to legalize gambling to try to get people to come as tourists. In 1941, we have the first hotel, which was the El Rancho Vegas, which was out on what is now the well, it's actually not quite the Las Vegas Strip. In 1946, we have the fabulous Flamingo that was built by Bugsy Siegel. That was on the Strip. Bugsy Siegel was a known mobster, and the mob was involved in the gambling for decades. Then in 67, Howard Hughes, who was a businessman, came into Las Vegas and started to buy out a lot of different hotels and casinos in Las Vegas. And this was the beginning of the transition from the mob to business owned. The mob still had some control in the 60s, even into the 70s, but this was the beginning. Howard Hughes was, the Hughes Corporation still owns a lot of land in Las Vegas Valley. In the 80s, we have a lot more corporate control in mega resorts, where you have Hilton and Mirage and a lot of other big companies coming into the Las Vegas area. And then lastly, in the 90s, we have even more mega resorts. So the Strip just explodes with MGM, Bellagio. There was a decrease, just like everything else in the United States after 9/11. But then there were still these mega mergers and expansions in 04 and 06. We had MGM and Mandalay Bay, Harrah's and Caesars. Then the City Center and Echelon and Palazzo were being planned. Then that 7, 8, 9 recession hit. So like City Center sat there kind of halfway completed for a few years until we had this kind of economic recovery here. Once again, 2009 was a terrible year. But since then, we have increases in visitor volume and average daily rate and just about everything else in Las Vegas. So this is an example of how you could take any city, New York, Chicago, any city, and look at it, and you could see how it mirrors the cyclical nature of the entire country and also the cyclical nature of the entire industry. And the last slide is just an example of all of the different buildings and different resorts that have been built on the Las Vegas Strip. This is as of 2013. And there's still some other, especially over in here, there's still some other construction that's taking place right now. So that's the end of the history section. Our next section we're going to cover is all about the hotel industry statistics and specific data on the industry.